All the way back in 2012, I obtained Kingdoms of Amalur the day it launched. Pre-release, I'd been intrigued by what I saw, and I was fairly hyped for it, so I dropped a pre-order as one does, and I picked it up right away. Upon turning it on, I was further pleased by what I played. The world was gorgeous, the lore deep, and the gameplay, or more specifically, its combat, felt great. But as the day or days wore on and I continued to grind away, my initial pleasure gave way to boredom. And while I put tons of hours into it, I never did complete that initial run of the game. By the time I gave up on it, I just didn't like it anymore, and seeing the ending didn't matter to me. However, as the years rolled on and its cult following grew, within the back of my mind has been a nagging thought that maybe if I replayed it, I'd discover what so many others love. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time I've played a game and disliked it, only to replay it years later to find a true appreciation. So when Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning was announced, my ears perked up. 8 years on, and I was ready to jump back into the Phalanx and hopefully discover a newfound love for an RPG many consider underrated. So after playing it through to completion this time, what are my thoughts? Well, sadly, I fell into the same trap as before. I thoroughly enjoyed my first bit of time with it, but as the days wore on, I got exhausted by the ordeal. Though perhaps this time made worse, as I don't remember my first experience being this damn buggy. Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning does not run well on a PS4 Pro. During my first few days with it, I encountered loads of bugs, including one which wouldn't let me interact with objects within the world, meaning I couldn't loot chests, pick up dropped items, or even open doors. But then on Saturday a patch dropped, so I assumed the most obnoxious problems would be fixed. But following that, I experienced more visual errors than before, including but not limited to dead bodies swapping between bright colors or random shapes popping off within the world. I also saw an uptick in crashes, with my console going to the dreaded blue screen quite a few times. On top of that, I got stuck inside a door, stealth kills often tripped out with the animations going all over the place, some NPCs turned invisible except for their clothes, the camera during combat sometimes flew off the rails, and while I no longer had problems opening doors or chests, every so often would be a loot bag I couldn't interact with. Perhaps most frustratingly, at least for me, one of my trophies even broke. It's the one for playing the game on hard, so if you're a trophy hunter like I am, beware of that. Adding to the technical woes is that the frame rate can hit single digits. This mostly happened when using magic, but given my secondary weapon was a staff, I saw drops during nearly every single fight. Honestly, the performance here is just abysmal and inexcusable. This is an 8-year-old game running on better machinery, and it frankly should not be this problematic. This is a very lazy port. There's even minor things like when talking to a shopkeeper, you sometimes have to wait 10 to 20 seconds for the option to browse their wares to appear, resulting in you just awkwardly waiting for the prompt. The poor optimization is most apparent in the load screens. They take forever, and because of how the game is structured, you will sit through hundreds of them. For this review, I put about 40 to 50 hours into the game, and I shudder to think what percentage of that time was due to loading. Here's an example of how painful it can become. One mission required me to go collect materials throughout the world for a guy at a location you can upgrade called Gravhall. Upon collecting the materials, I fast traveled back to his location. This is one load screen. However, it doesn't put you in the Gravhall courtyard, it puts you outside the door leading to it. So upon fast traveling to the keep, you then need to open the door, which is yet another load screen. When that's done, I run to the guy, talk to him, and he tells me I need to go talk to someone else. So within 30 seconds, I'm clicking to fast travel somewhere else. That's yet another load screen. Luckily, she's outside, so I talk to her, she agrees to go to the place, so I fast travel back to the keep, load some more, finish, open the door, load screen, and you get the idea. This isn't just one weird isolated incident either, as there's a lot of missions that task you with talking to someone who then tells you to go talk to someone else, so you're constantly running from load screen to load screen, and these load screens are long. This becomes more apparent when traveling within a city. They're broken into sections, so if you have a mission telling you to talk to a specific person, you load during fast traveling, then you run through the city to get to the next section, which is yet another load, then you might spend literally 10 seconds or less running through that section to get to another, which results in another load screen. screen. And then when you're finally within the area where the person is at, you still have to enter the building, which is yet another load screen. After the convo, expect more load screens just leaving the building. It's this structure that by the end of the game, it was driving me nuts. I hated the pacing and structure of so many missions. I get that back in the day, this was due to technical limitations of last-gen hardware, but it seems absurd that it still takes this long to load something on a PS4 Pro. Setting aside my frustration with the load times or the other technical issues, I will admit that when the game is running well, it does look good. I'm not even sure the graphics have been touched for this re-release, but thanks to some good art direction and creative design, Kingdoms of Amalur holds up. It's obviously not a game from 2020 or anything, but I really enjoy its style. Even things like the enemy design exudes creativity. Take these skeletal pirate enemies. The way they've been weaved together with overgrown roots gives them more personality than your typical skeletal foes. The same goes for quite a few other enemies within the world. I liked getting up and close and exploring their designs. The original team did a great job constructing everything. I find its style charming and it really pulled me in. The only issue I have with how the world looks is that early on it's all bright and colorful, and while it gives off a typical forested fantasy look, I really liked it. But as the game goes on, you move on to newer areas that are less pleasing to look at. For instance, the desert sections just look empty and dull. This is further evident as a lot of missions take place within caves or underground areas and such, and it doesn't do the game any favors. I would have preferred more outdoorsy areas or a more unique take on overly long chambers or corridors. Put simply, the game is at its best when there's good use of color and a scattering of objects and such. Also, as a quick aside, these doors are awesome.
Is there anything I can assist with?
Moving on to the actual meat of the game, I can comfortably state that combat in the game feels great. As already mentioned, it is sadly hampered by technical issues as the framerate becomes abysmal when using staves or other magical spells, but focusing just on the options the game gives you and how it feels while doing so, I have nothing but positive things to say. As a player, you can equip 2 weapons at any time, and these are attached to the square and triangle buttons, and with the addition of abilities which can run the gamut from frost traps to storm bolts to a myriad of other options, there's a deeper level of play involved than one might think from the outset. It felt great to chain together combos using a variety of weapons, of which there's plenty of. My main build was a staff and a set of daggers, and while I rarely deviated from it, at any time I could have swapped those out for a longsword, greatsword, scepter, bow, hammer, feyblades, or chakrams. Chakrams? Whatever. And each one feels different. I genuinely like the variety on display. Throw in something called Reckoning mode, and there's even more to play with. This probably doesn't require explaining, but as you complete missions and engage in combat, you earn experience, and with each level gained, you get 1 point to dump into a skill and another 3 points to drop into an abilities menu. As with so much else within this game, there's a lot of options here to explore. For instance, in the skill screen, you can drop points into Mercantile, Sagecraft, Stealth, and Dispelling, just to name a few. And in certain areas of each skill bar, you unlock extra bonuses. For example, with my build, I primarily went with Alchemy, Detect Hidden, and Persuasion. The final option of Detect Hidden shows me on my mini-map where collectible lore stones are, with others before that highlighting secret chests and hidden doors. All of this I found beneficial. In regards to the ability screen, there's 3 different skill trees, one each for Finesse, Sorcery, and Might, and as you move up the skill tree you get new combat abilities and passive skills. I went with a jack-of-all-trades build, so I had points dumped into all 3. So in combat I'd often throw bolts of electricity while setting freeze traps or using an earthquake move. Towards the end I even experimented with poison. Ooh. As an extra bonus, and as yet another example of the options the game gives you, as you move through the ability screen, you unlock new destinies. These are tarot card-like things that grant you passive bonuses and such. So with my jack-of-all-trades build, I ended the game as a polymath tier 5, meaning my magic, range, and melee attacks all had a 17% damage buff, among other things. Matching destinies in a similar way are Twists of Fate. These are tied into story and faction quests, and as you move through them and make decisions that impact the world, new fates become unlocked, and these are permanent passive buffs. I won't spoil them here, but there's some really good ones to obtain. Speaking of story-related content, the plot itself is actually fairly interesting. To avoid spoilers, I'm only going to give the most basic rundown, but the game begins with your death. It starts off on a somewhat awkward note as you watch your character die before you hit the character creation screen, and they go so far as to show the stand-in character's face, but following that scene it finds good footing. As said, you're dead, but thanks to magical fuckery, you are granted life again, and this allows your character to become a chosen one to save the realm as you are no longer beholden to fate. You are unthreaded from the same tapestry as everyone else, so this grants you the powers to alter destiny. Pretty badass, if I say so myself. Though, something that's not badass, however, is the inventory. How's that for a segue, by the way? The game only allows the player to hold so much loot, and instead of weight, it's just a select amount of items, and throughout the world, some vendors sell backpacks that can raise this threshold, but the game would have been so much better without this arbitrary limitation. There is just so much loot within this game, and even though I stayed on top of junking items and selling it, it felt like I was always hitting the limit, and then I'd have to go manage items and break them down, and it just got tedious. I can't stress enough, there's a ridiculous amount of loot. It's one of those games where you're swapping gear at a consistent pace. Although the amount of loot matches the game given everything here is done in abundance. There's just so much to do. We're talking hundreds of side quests, hundreds of chests to find, loads of locations to complete, tons of collectible lore stones, and an endless supply of enemies to kill. Throw in the combat variety and everything else, and there's a lot of game here. But in my opinion, there's too much of it. By the end, I was so worn out on missions and side quests that heading towards the final boss, I just stopped engaging in combat altogether. The last area is just poorly paced in general, and as you push through this lengthy path, there's a new fight every few feet, and it just got to be way too much, so I booked it. No joke, it probably shaved a good hour plus off my runtime in this final section. At the end of the day, I don't hate Kingdoms of Amalur. Even with my criticisms, I can acknowledge that there's something special here. It's just that what's here isn't exactly for me. I genuinely like its arcadey combat, and its art direction is good, but the structure of it leaves a lot to be desired. This is a title I would raise an example of the perils of excess. But that's just me, because the fact is, this game also has a dedicated cult following. Where I dislike it, many others love it, and I can understand why. It is a mechanically sound experience with a world that from a lore perspective has been built with a lot in mind, which makes this a weird title in that I can't recommend one either play or skip it. It's a game where you have to decide if what's presented can lure you in or not, because it's not a bad game, it's really not. It's just an RPG that isn't for me. The best I can advise is that you don't drop $40 on this current iteration. It is technically janky, and you'd probably be better off replaying the original should you still have access to older hardware. And if you don't, then wait for a sale on this one and a good handful of patches.